let's get going. Okay, wonderful to see you folks back. Yeah? And as you can see, things change here quite quickly. So we've built this shed for you guys so you don't get boiled as you have kind of remember from last year. We've also built it because we hope to start teaching inside this space soon in August. Apart from whatever, this kind of teaching, we're hoping to do two things. One is if people want to stay over, we'll pitch tents here so they can stay over at night. And the second thing is we'll actually start doing building here. So the workshop's here. So we're going to start 3 new courses which are kind of active. So one is called building. So people can actually start, doing stuff with their hands and doing whatever it is. Which means if people get bored of what you're doing, you can come and join them. Yeah? No, seriously, we're going to do some interesting stuff here. So it's really wonderful to see you folks. More people will be coming in during the day. But we thought we'll open a conversation on, what we can do with you guys, what can happen in other places. We had a very good kickoff of in Delhi late kind of last year. And, a few of us took people around the city and had a good time. We had actually a panel discussion, which was quite interesting. But here we can do a lot more because it's just effectively around the corner. And, if you ever want to come to this place rather than BCC, then there's shuttles that run every day. So, that's a kind of easy thing to say. So we thought we'll just open a quick conversation on, what you can do, what you'd want to do. And, as things are growing and changing here, there are lots of new things that are happening. So some people are more science-oriented, so the labs are available. We're starting a big new initiative here on urban agriculture. So we're actually growing things, and people are helping grow things. We'll be building a new teaching kitchen. That's a new thing that we're going to do here, just around the corner from there, where once we grow things, we can actually cook it. So that's also going to come up here. Plus, there's, you saw a little bit of it, but it's now almost done. In another 5-6 weeks, I think the grass would be done in the arena. So there's a whole place that's there where, we can do stuff. It's available pretty much, I would say 275 days of the year, if not more. So that's another space that we can use. So there are more and more spaces that we can use in this space. Oh, exciting. Yeah, something's happening somewhere. So we just thought we'll open a discussion to see what we can do together. You all know that, IIHS is an open institution, so whatever we have is available to everybody, and especially to you folks, whether it's a library or lots of other things that are happening. So we thought we'll pick up that conversation, and yeah. Huh? No, it's not thunder. Actually, we were joking this year, and the team has been quite concerned about it. Last year, we fried you folks, fine? So this year, we did 2 things to be a little bit smarter than last year. First, we were starting a little bit later in the evening. So hopefully, the sun will be down. I think the sun is going to follow its own course. But then there was this challenge that there was this cyclonic storm going to be building up. So there was this idea that there's going to be rain throughout. So last year, you got fried. This year, we'll flood you out. Locusts, yeah. Locusts, if they come this far into India, then we'll be in trouble. Because they usually come across from, Horn of Africa, Pakistan, whatever it is. So anyway, so we're here, and we'll pick up the thing and hand over to Sudeshna, and whatever, we'll get going. Lots of old folks are here, plus new, so we can, people will dribble in over time. But this is an open conversation. I think we can go as long as we want to, no? Come. Yeah. Hi. Normally, people keep places at the back for people who come in late. Now we keep them in the front. So everybody can say hi to you when you come. Come. Okay. Good. Over to you folks.
Thank you, Aru. Okay, so we are going to actually do a panel conversation now. So I am going to invite a whole set of people, Rashali, Head, Pratigna, Chandni, Divya. Am I missing someone? No, right? 2, 4, 5, 6. Yes, 6 of us. So this is the first part of the evening, so to say. We wanted to sort of have a event around sort of formally starting the Bangalore chapter of UFP Alumni. And many of you are here from Bangalore, and some of you are here from outside Bangalore also, and more will be coming. But I think many of you also requested that if this opening of this chapter could also involve a conversation around the various things that IIHS itself is doing in Bangalore. So what we thought that we'll do in this panel discussion is, you can see a lot of people here because there's a lot of work happening in Bangalore. We'll just get a little bit of a snippet, 10, 12 minutes across a whole set of things. But what I want to say even early on is that we have a long time on our hands, so feel free to ask questions about the projects. Which of the projects many of you are peripherally involved also, so which is really a nice thing. But we also want to hear from you in the Q&A session about the kind of work that you are doing, in your organizations, which is also happening in Bangalore. So this is definitely kind of a two-way conversation. We'll start off with some of the stuff here. So, we don't really have an order in mind, but who wants to go first? Chandni will go first. And in fact, Chandni is talking to you about two projects, right? Yeah. Do you have a mic, Chandni?
No, I don't. So just mirrored, no?
Yeah, it's just mirrored there.
Lovely to see all of you here. All right, so I'm going to be talking about two projects, and Pratigna will also be chipping in a bit, especially maybe on the TSP bit. I'll call you in when. Two bits of work that the climate change team has been doing. One specifically on thinking about climate change adaptation. So that's really the idea. Hopefully all of you remember that's the idea that we see a lot of climate risks, and how do we then deal with them and plan for reducing climate risks. All right, so this project was actually quite a long time ago, from 2014 to, 5-year long project, and that's the project Pratigna and I also joined IIHS with. So it's nice to now reflect back on this work. It was a multi-country, multi-year engagement that looked at how do semi-arid regions across Asia and Africa deal with climate change? And then what are really the barriers and enablers to dealing with climate change? And then what can be, how do we really use that research, the findings that we have from African and Asian countries, how do we use that really to make some change on the ground? So just a quick, I cannot in any way summarize a 5-year long project in 5 minutes, so I'm just going to really give you a big overview and then talk a bit about the Bangalore stuff really. Just to give you a sense, this was the scope of the project. We had various countries that we were working in, and IIHS was anchoring the work in India, and we were leading it here. As I said, the main idea of the project was to think about what are the barriers, enablers for effective, widespread, and sustained adaptation action. And so all these terms that you see here were deeply battled over for all the 5 years. What's effective? What do you mean by effectiveness? How widespread? How do you think about inclusion when you think about climate action? And then sustained over what period of time? And at least for the project, we decided that we want to think of that was in 2014-15, so we want to think to the time period of the SDGs, which was 2030. And so that was the time scale from present to 2030 that we were focusing on. And this at that time actually was the largest climate change adaptation project in the world. I think at its peak, there were 200 people across all these countries who were working in this project. And as I said earlier, IIHS was leading the India work, and we were focusing with other partners in particular geographies. So we were looking at, there's one slide missing. Anyway, so we were looking at climate impacts in Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. And then going into Karnataka, we were really interested in understanding who are the most vulnerable people. And we understand that rural and urban areas face climate impacts differently. And what we were really trying to understand that when people move from rural to urban areas, what are the kinds of risks they're moving out of from villages, and then what are the risks that they're moving into once they come into cities. So we started our work really actually in Bangalore, where we said who are the most vulnerable people to climate change and other non-climatic factors in the city. And we did a whole lot of scoping visits. I mean, there was a lot of work around, first of all, mapping informal settlements in cities, mapping places that are flood prone, heat prone, where's built up area coming up. So a lot of geospatial analysis done to understand risk from a climatic and a physical point of view. And then we really moved on to see who are the people living in these areas. And often we'd find that migrants, people who are coming into the city and are living for very short times in the city, tend to be the ones who are most vulnerable. So we focused on migration as one of the things. Of course, there were many other angles we took in the project, and I'm just going to really focus on the migration bit. All right, leave the slide. So let's talk a bit about that. We started from Bangalore and asked this question, who are the most vulnerable people in the city? And then backtracked to a couple of rural districts to chart their stories of migration and movement and what's driving people into the city. The two sites we chose in rural areas was Kolar, which is a district very close to Bangalore, and people often commute daily. So you have these 180 rupee train passes that people use and then come into the city every day. On the other hand, we took another rural district in North Karnataka called Gulbarga and now Kalaburgi, which where it's a historically drought-prone district, and people are leaving farming there, or if you're landless, you are leaving agricultural labor, being an agricultural laborer there, and then coming into the city. And these people tend to come, they're a little more, it's a slightly more long-term migration. You tend to move with your families. And then what we did is really start doing in-depth, multi-year data collection through household surveys, through our scoping visits, through group discussions, which were often with men and women differently, and then these in-depth life history interviews where we would follow families from rural to urban areas over multiple years and multiple people in those families. So a man, a woman, a father, mother, yeah, I mean, basically looking at it within a family to see that when people move, first of all, what risks move with them, and are these differentiated within the household and then also between households. So as you can imagine, I mean, I'm giving you this lovely sanitized story of this research project. It wasn't so easy. There were a lot of back and forth, a lot of reading of the literature. At that time, unlike now, climate change and migration wasn't as explored as it is now, I think, and so it was quite cutting edge at that time. We also had to deal with slightly more broader or slightly more dominant ideas of, I mean, there's a huge literature on migration from development studies, from geography, from economics, of course, but the climate change folks weren't really understanding what do you do with this, you know, this whole body of people that are moving, and often people who are moving from, that's what, drought-prone rural areas to flood-prone Bangalore. What does that mean for climate action? How do you plan for this very mobile population? So yeah, these are some pictures just from the field about how we would, often in these settlements, we were not able to, I mean, lots of people were illiterate, so just giving you a flavor of the kinds of methods we used, where we tend to use pictures to sort of elicit responses. And now coming to, I mean, again, there's so much that we wrote out of this that I can't do the findings justice, but I just want to say that one of the big things that we said is, of course, even today when people ask us about, is climate change, I mean, the one question people want to know is climate change driving migration? And the answer is yes and no. You just don't know enough. First of all, there is no one reason that drives people to move, but what I always say is that that climate change is changing the rules of the game under which people were moving. So now you've got people who were typically moving because of changing aspirations, just job opportunities in the city or bright lights of the city, but also are getting pushed out because agriculture is no longer a viable livelihood. Groundwater levels are depleting. Rainfall is becoming much more uncertain. So there is a layer that climate change brings to migration that we need to understand from the driver's side. But what is less understood is once people move into cities, how do they experience and how do they then deal with climate change? And so we collected a lot of data to show that currently migration does lead to better incomes. There is better material well-being, but we are seeing that it leads to more work burdens within the household, so women especially who move. It also has led to a lot of mental stress, and we call that subjective well-being or quality of life. So we had charted these indicators for different households and seen how for men and women it was differentiated. And so finally what we ended up saying is that at best, migration is still a means of getting by if you look at it from a climate change adaptation point of view. You are not adapting to, say, 2024's heat waves or floods in a city like Bangalore. You aren't. And so therefore, you're just managing to get by with where you are currently. That's what we call coping rather than adaptation. And also, this is what another thing that I do want to highlight, that although we do a lot of research on urban areas, with Bangalore often being a locus of that research, this particular project also helped us build links to rural areas and see how what happens in cities has very real impacts in rural areas. And so we saw that actually the remittances that migrants are earning out here and sending back, they tend to fuel more unsustainable practices in villages, like taking out further loans for building bore wells, which is then further depressing groundwater levels, which is then leading to more migration and so on. So you've got these cycles of extraction that are happening because of migration. And so the argument is we really need to be thinking of these as social ecological systems at a much larger scale and not just let's focus on a small ward or a small thing. There's no harm in doing that, but also to remember that these are embedded in larger spaces. I'm going to now, I'll come back to this just to say that if people are really interested in this project, it's over, but actually this year we are still publishing papers from that because that's how long academic publishing takes. And there's this website and you can look at it. There's a lot of material on Bangalore from various elements, because what I spoke about is more around the rural work that we did, but we have a lot of data from Bangalore urban. We have a lot of data from peri-urban areas in Bangalore to also understand how livelihoods were changing, gender dynamics were changing in peri-urban areas. So there's a lot of work, and if you all are interested, definitely go and see this. But one of the other innovations in the project was around this thing called transformative scenario planning, which we tested out, and I'll ask Pratigna to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so as part of the project, and this is something that we had intended to do right from the beginning as an entire project in different countries and different locations, was to use this methodology called transformative scenario planning. Basically, it is a methodology that uses scenario planning at the heart of it to sort of especially in situations which are very stuck, very complex, involves a large and diverse set of stakeholders who may or may not be on the same understanding of where the system is, and therefore very dynamic, complex, and complicated situation. We use this process as a way to sort of unpack what the dynamics among the different actors in that system, as well as try and understand the system itself a little better, and then using that understanding to sort of move forward into a visioning process of what would an ideal future that is inclusive of all stakeholder concerns look like. And so while working on this climate change adaptation program in a city like Bangalore, the biophysical challenges for the city became quite an important entry point for us to start looking at things. And one of the things that from various pieces of work that started to surface was the water system of Bangalore, which is quite complex, complicated, as well as in a stuck situation, given that there are so many actors involved in it, there are so many challenges both from the demand and the supply side, just from understanding and managing the natural resource, water resource itself. So it's a very, very complicated landscape of both issues, actors, as well as sort of trying to imagine a future that might work for all the stakeholders involved, but also the future of the city. So that was really a starting point to sort of engage with more than 60 very diverse set of stakeholders from different sort of communities of practice, action. We engaged with government officials as much as we did with civil society organizations, as much as we engaged with citizens themselves. The different bodies involved around water management, both from the supply side and as well as like consumers, RWAs, and things like that. So over a period of 18 months, we ran this process where starting from bringing all these different people onto to the same platform, but to also understand, what are their concerns around the water system of Bangalore, to almost develop a vocabulary that was shared among all the stakeholders, and to sort of say, these are the issues for us, for a particular group of people as compared to somebody else, say from the government or those managing these resources. And over 3 or 4 workshops, we sort of really unpacked this whole thing and then sort of created 4 scenarios of what the future of water could look like, which involves all the stakeholders in the room to be participants in that future and in that scenario of water management. So there was not a definite outcome of the 18-month-long engagement that we had with the stakeholders, but what did happen was there was definitely a more sort of, there was definitely a shared understanding of what was happening to the system. And one of the unintended consequences of what happened was that people started to talk to each other even without us, really. So there was, a small enterprise that was setting up eco-STPs and thinking about water and things like that, talking to resident welfare associations about how they can better their system. There were citizens who had come from small lake encroached areas, talking actually to that's all right. Talking actually to government officials, talking about their concerns for the place, for the area, but also understanding what it means from the planning side of things when it comes to issues like encroachment or, even water supply in informal settlements and those kinds of things. So we stopped facilitating that engagement after 4 workshops and after building out this 4 scenarios that everybody agreed on, signed off on. But what we do know is there was a lot of conversations that continued to happen among various stakeholders even after we stopped facilitating those discussions. And so one of the things that we'd also wanted to sort of highlight through this experience is that adaptation is also over a very long period of time. So you do facilitate something, you put the right people in touch with each other, you sort of try and unpack the issue, and then it takes its own course to build out solution over much longer periods of time. And usually the idea is, again, sort of reiterating what Chandni said, is to look at it at a systemic level. So you can't end up looking just at the supply side of, the water resource or the demand side of it, or just lake rejuvenation. So really to start looking at things at a systemic level and keep the socio-ecological systems perspective at the heart of it.
I just want to add one small thing just to say that if you all are interested, so we hear these ideas of multi-stakeholder participation, participatory processes, stakeholder engagement, which sound really great on paper, and we often put them in our project proposals, and we hope that magically they're going to change all the power hierarchies that are there in systems. There's a reason why the lakes of Bangalore are the way they are, or there's a reason why you have floods and droughts in so many of our cities, one after the other. So the TSP process was birthed in post-apartheid South Africa, and it's a wonderful story to read and understand. That you can imagine the level of complexity contested agendas and a stuck system, right? From that to, and in this project, we apply it to the water scarcity story of Bangalore. And you can see these scenarios also in this, this graphic form of doomsday, not so bad at all, the great divide, and being hopeful as these 4 quadrants we try to build out. I think many of you will recognize this because this was in the classroom on the 2nd floor, right? So you'll recognize this graphic. So just to say, there's a lot more you can read, and we ourselves, it's not coming back to that point of stakeholder consultations and engagement. As much as you want the stakeholders to engage, we need to build our capacities in how do you do engagement, what is meaningful dialogue, what are the tricks you can use to engage people. And I think that project allowed us to learn some of those things, and it's only much later, like so many years later, you're able to apply what you've learned there to other projects. So remember that this journey of engaging stakeholders who don't want to engage with each other is a very long story, and it takes time for us to first build our capacities and then to sort of even enable such processes. It's very easy to say, why don't we have participatory governance and all of that? But it takes time, and it takes a lot of skill to do that.
No, point well noted. Thanks so much. We'll come back to the UP Agri project. Vrashali, do you want to take over with the off-grid city?
Hello everybody, lovely to see most of you here, because I remember like some of you always will also recognize this project as you are part of this project. So also nice to present where this piece of work is right now. So I'll be talking about this project that we are doing in partnership with urban universities and other urban centers across Asia and Africa. This is a project which is being funded by UKRI GCRF Fund, and the lead university over here is Institute of Development Studies. The project is carried on in 5 cities of the Global South. We're looking at Tamale in Ghana, Harare in Zimbabwe, there's Mossel Bay in South Africa, Colombo in Sri Lanka, and in India we're looking at it in Bangalore. The main objective of this particular project is to understand and reframe infrastructure planning and governance to basically look at the how does the lives of the most marginalized change with the infrastructure complexities that exist. So we're looking at the particular infrastructure of 5 different categories. We're looking at water, sanitation, drainage, transportation, and communication, and how does that impact the lives of the most vulnerable. We're also looking at when these infrastructures are planned in silos and the impact that the constraints of these infrastructures have on the life. What does it lead to in terms of the basic needs of the people? So for example, we're looking at food particularly, and how does the various constraints that exist, how does that impact the food consumption, the food provisioning for the particular neighborhoods and at a city scale. So what we have done is, this is again a 3-year-long project that we are doing. We're in the 3rd year of the project. So the first year, we looked at a low-income neighborhood. We tried to understand the infrastructure that exists in terms of the grid and off-grid arrangements that are there at a household level. We then moved at the food consumption patterns at a household level, trying to do it through a journaling mechanism, where we actually recruited community enumerators, trained the community enumerators over there, and picked up parts of the neighborhood where we would do this journaling exercise. That allowed us to look at what implications exist for the particular houses in terms of the food provisioning and food consumption. And this is something that also came out of the household study, where we're looking at how does infrastructure consolidate at a household level, at a neighborhood level. So this is again one of the contributions of one of the fellows here, who's looking at how infrastructure moves from between grid to off grid, and how does that consolidate at a household level, at a neighborhood level. The second part of the study is looking at the food provisioning mechanism. So now we are moving a little macro level. We have gone out from the neighborhood study to the city level study, where we are trying to understand the commodity flows and the value chains of particular food items which are prominent for the neighborhood. So because of the first part of the study, we could see what is the food items that are being consumed by low income neighborhood, and we are tracking how does this move across the study, across the city. So we're looking at particular markets we have picked up, and again, given the value chain and the commodity flow, it's done in a city in the south. It's not very linear. It happens in a very zigzag manner. So we have applied a slightly different methodology where we are not tracing particularly from a neighborhood, it goes to the retail shop, to the wholesale, but we are actually incorporating it with the prominent city nodes that exist in the city. So we are looking at KR Market, we are looking at the fish market at Russell Market, we are looking at Electronic City Mandi. We are trying to understand what is the infrastructure that exists at these particular nodes, how does that enable food provisioning at a neighborhood level, and how does the food move across the city. The major output, as in before talking about these, the major agenda of this research project is to see how we can reframe the conversations that are going on between planners, between municipal officials and other stakeholders to actually shift gears and talk about infrastructure together and its implication on food. So how can we incorporate the idea of food planning in the city planning framework? Some of the outputs that have come out of this project is there's a working paper that's already out which has put out this narrative on integrating in food planning with infrastructure. The part of this work was also presented in the African Infrastructure Future Conference. And now we're also presenting a part of our work at RC21, which is a paper on repair. It's talking about infrastructure repair, particularly, and how it gets consolidated given the off-grid arrangements that exist at a neighborhood level. And then we're talking about assemblage from the study. Again, this is an ongoing study. We are in the middle of the study. Our report is due next week, so we're also in the middle of a lot of fieldwork and writing. But we do look forward to a lot of new conversations coming out of this particular research, because this is a rather unexplored work that we have started off right now. But happy to also get in more questions and think about engagements with other folks who are there in Bangalore.
Thanks so much, Vaishali. Harry, BMRCL.
Right. Hi everyone, I'm Harry. I'm gonna talk about a project which is looking at transit-oriented development in Bangalore. It is a multi-consortium project involving multiple government agencies as well. So IIHS is looking at a lot of urban planning, capacity building, communication works. We have Devyani here, who's also part of the consortium, looking at part of the IBI group, which is actually the main project partner, looking at a lot of transit-oriented development as a whole, placemaking, multimodal integration, and all that. And it also involves a lot of government stakeholders. So there's BMRCL, which operates the metro. There's DALT, which is the Transportation Coordination Agency. There's international banks like Asian Development Bank, which is actually funding the project. And there's also a lot of other institutional partners which have stake in the project, including BMTC or BDA or BBMP and so on. So it is a very large project in some sense, looking at how does the metro influence the development of the city, and how can actually we integrate the metro into our daily lives. So I'm sure when a lot of you were coming here, you must have done some very advanced maths to figure out how do you get from wherever you are to here. Even though there's a metro right here, you must have figured out how do I get here, and so on. And I think a major component of the project is also to look at how do we make transportation systems more accessible to as many people as possible, and so on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. You can just skip that slide. Yeah. So like I was saying, there's a lot of different teams at IIHS that are also involved, and this is just to acknowledge them. We of course have the research and practice teams that are taking our work forward, and looking at like all the questions that you have asked as part of our other projects. But we also have other teams, including the UPP team, which is looking at the institutional design and capacity building. And then the comms team, which is looking at the long-term communication strategies required for the project. And we also have some external partners and so on. And of course, the labs. Yeah, but so this is a very interesting slide that I really like to focus on. So we are looking at the 2A, 2B phase of the Bangalore Metro, which runs along the outer ring road and leads all the way to the airport. And what is very interesting here is that like the project is trying to capture multiple scales across the city. So if you look at the first image, you see like where does the metro go along within the city and what neighborhood is it going along and so on. In the second map, you see like what all area does it capture. And while it might not look like a lot, if you think about it, it's close to like 10 to 15% of your full city. So if some development is going to come in and it's going to affect 15% of your total city area, how do you think about that? Or what all is it that you need to consider? Like 15% is a lot if you think about it. And then the third part is like looking at all of this at a very small station area level. So how does whatever planning or development strategy that you plan at a station level, how does that then translate into a corridor level planning or a city level planning scale and so on, and or the vice versa as well? Like how do you think about large scale interventions at a city scale that also influence the station area planning and so on? Yeah, but just go to the next slide. Yeah. So just talking about, like many of you might have this question of what actually is transit-oriented development. And the very simple concept is that if we look at a station area of 10-minute walking from, let's say, any station, metro station that exists, or 15-minute by cycling or using a bus and so on, the whole concept is that you get as many people to live in that 15-minute area. You live there, you work there, you play there, and so on, so that people can access the metro as easily as possible and can access all the uses that they have to ensure that the use of private vehicle is reduced as much as possible. So the T stands for the transit, the O is oriented, saying like we can provide as many services as possible in those areas, and the D is the development, ensuring like the uses that exist correspond to what like you would want to do within the areas that you are living in and are not like something that might disrupt your access to a transportation corridor and so on. Yeah, so the thing that I was talking about earlier, which is that the project has three main focuses. One is of course the transit-oriented development, which is what kind of use cases, what kind of development models do you need to exist within those area spaces, the 500 meter or the kilometer or the 2 kilometers, there's multiple levels to it. But then also, how can you ensure that there are multiple modes of access to these metro stations? So how can you reach to these places by walking, cycling, buses, or other forms of transportation? And how do all these different forms of transportation work seamlessly together? So it's not a option of like you can only take the bus or only take the metro or so on, but how can you use a complement of these services together to get to whatever place you want to reach in the city in the most convenient way possible? And the third, of course, is capacity building, which I'll talk to you in a bit later. But of course, like, but the whole idea is that if you are building these large plans or building these large visions, at the end of the day, it is not you who's going to have to execute these plans, but actually the institution, the government bodies that are going to take your strategies or your recommendations and then translate into some master plan or other government notifications and so on, which will actually then get implemented. And so how do you translate the research or the vision that you see in your through your understanding of the neighborhoods, the corridor, and so on, and translate the same information to these government officials and help them understand that how can you execute it and what is the reason for executing it and so on. So So that is an equally big component of the project as well. Yeah, like this is just to show like what all are we working on. And as you can see, like when you think about 500 meters in general, it doesn't look like a very big area, but like if somebody asks you to walk 500 meters across some corridor, you'll actually realize that it's quite a big distance to cover. And I think, so what we were trying to show here is just that like, so if, I don't know if you can see that yellow line on your screens, it might not be visible to the people at the back, but that just gives you a sense of like what this 500 meter looks like when you look at it from the scale and so on. And yeah, just go on. Yeah, sorry, I hadn't taken the amount, like how big the screen is going to be, but the images that you see currently are showing you like different modes again. And so if you're able to follow the red line on the left image, it is a pretty straight walk path that will take you directly to the metro. And then there's this other one on the right hand side, which will actually show you a very curvy path where you have to take a lot of turns to get to the metro. And like if I have to ask you which one would you prefer, most of you would prefer the most convenient straight route that you might want to take. And I think what this example helps you to understand is just like getting a sense of like, in a lot of like inner city areas, a lot of our cities are already built, a lot of our networks already exist. And so when we think about building these new concepts in certain areas, it might be quite easy to do it, where you already have that networks of street that exist. It might just be a question of like retrofitting and all that. But in a lot of the other areas, transportation was not the primary focus of development, right? Like our cities are built through infill development, and it might not really be the focus when those neighborhoods were built. And so how do you also think about areas which might not actually conform to the uses that you want to build on? And how do you get these strategies into these places? So the bottom two images actually show you two very different examples. The one on the left is a BRTS example where people have been put into focus about like how do you actually get people to the bus stand, even though if it's going through the middle of the road, right? Whereas the one on the right is an image from Gurgaon, where the metro is going right next to a development, but there is a highway in the middle of it. And so even though it is within that 500 meter that we talk about, to get to the metro station, you have to actually cross a highway, and there's no dedicated footpath or so on. And so, like, is that still a transit-oriented development where you're saying like, okay, I'm living right next to the metro, but I have to cross a highway to get to the metro. So there is this concept called transit-oriented development and transit-adjacent development. In India, a lot of times what we see is actually that we have a lot of our developments are in prime properties located right next to these big metro stations and so on, but the access is not really thought about. It is just the adjacency that is what is really marketed and so on. So even like, how do you think about improving those accesses, even though when like things might be at an arm's distance, it might not really be directly accessible and so on. So that is another form of communication that we're trying to bring out of the project. Yeah, just you can go on. Yeah, I'll very quickly, so when we're talking about different scales of the project, right? Like one of the biggest questions and the challenge that we have faced is like creating data at those different scales, right? Like when any of you had taken the data class during your curriculum, you must have heard this question a lot, like when you were doing your practical, you'd be like, I want this specific information about this specific neighborhood, and I want it for like exactly today, what is the population and so on, right? And most of the times, the answer you would have gotten is like, that data doesn't exist. Like it either exists at some like very macro scale and so on. And so like when we are doing a project of this scale, where like you need as much data as possible to inform your planning decisions, what kind of techniques do you need? How do you think creatively about data generation as a method, as a practice, to be able to then come and be like, okay, this data doesn't exist in this form, but if you look at it, you can get some alternative indicators from some other source and so on. So if you just go to the next slide, this just gives you some sense of like what all data was used in the project. So we had to heavily depend on a lot of like satellite-based sources. We ended up mixing satellite-based sources with a lot of like secondary sources such as sensors, economic sensors, and so on, to be able to like integrate a lot of like real-time current information with actually what we know has been collected in the past and so on. And if you just go to the next slide, yeah. So here, these were some of the a lot of newer methods that we were able to explore and build on as part of the project. So when we were talking about like a station area development, one of the questions that we got asked a lot was how many people live in this 500-meter radius, and how many more people do we need? What is the density that we need to achieve? How much land is available? What is the FAR consumption? And a lot of these questions, which actually when we were doing our interviews with a lot of government agencies, and we used to ask them these questions, they're like, we also don't know. And so how do you then build these information? And so we ended up using a lot of temporal satellite data and combining that with population sensors to be able to predict what kind of densities exist, what kind of population exists, and what is using building height data, for example, to be able to predict FAR and so on. I see Sudeshna is pointing at a watch, so I'm just going to go very quickly. Yeah, and this is the other important thing. So when we are talking about development, in the initial phases, a lot of it was very market oriented, about thinking about how can we ensure that the real estate informs the development, which is conforming to the uses that we want, or meeting our transportation requirements and so on. And from our practice, since we teach a lot about diversity, inclusion, and so on, one of the biggest challenges for us was also to think about how can we create information that also helps communicate that message that you're not only planning for a particular segment of the society. It's a very big corridor, it is very diverse, and it has a lot of different people living in it. It has a lot of different economies that exist in it. And to be able to show that through data, maps, and so on. And I think that was the other important contribution, that we were able to take a lot of our other research work that we had done in other papers, other projects you might have heard about, Peak and so on, to be able to take a lot of those research-based methods and then bring them here and translate them into a very, to be able to show that in some formats. I'll just I think we covered this. Yeah, this also we talked about, just the database. Yeah, and so I was just talking about the institution. So you can see that there's a lot of land use and transportation planning that needs to come together. So if you just go to the next slide, you'll see that it actually ends up forming a very big maze. There's a lot of agencies, different agencies need to do a lot of different tasks. There's a lot of intergovernmental coordination that's required and so on. And so to be able to map and be who's going to do what, just go on to the next one. This just gives you a sense of what the project also helped us do a lot of stakeholder engagement with the government and the public. And it was very nice to be able to talk to people on a government table and be so if you are talking about transit-oriented development, what development uses do you think are really important to be integrated in the planning? And the answer most of the times was parking, which is actually the exact opposite of what you would want to hear. But the project also gave you that opportunity to be able to see and hear actually what the other side thinks about when you're talking about all this. Yeah. I talked a little bit about communications. We actually ended up going to a lot of different stations and doing talking to people at a lot of places and so on. Just keep going. Yeah, I think that is mostly it. Yeah, and I'll just take a minute to close it up. And I think these were the three main reflections, at least personally for me, while working on the project. The first one was how do we actually translate a lot of our research into practice? So a lot of things that we actually teach in the class, or like when we read or when we publish in academic journals, to be able to take those methods and take it to a government person and then be like, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and this is what you should do, and this might actually help you get a lot more information from what might exist outside. Or like, you know, thinking about a question like, what does a concept like TOD look like in a city like Bangalore? When people talk about TOD, people will be like, oh, let's plan like London, New York, Hong Kong, and all these places. And so the idea that ends up getting in your mind is like, you'll have these high-rise developments with like a lot of like fancy retail shops and so on. But in places like India, where like the buildings have already come in, the metro's coming later, how does those concepts translate? How do you build a transit-oriented city where the development has already happened and the transit is coming in later? Was something that was quite interesting and yeah. All right. Cool.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, this project has taken up many of our mind services for a long time, so we can keep talking about it for like days. So, but for today, we'll stop. Divya.
Okay, lovely to see all of you here. Also, it takes an alumni meet for us to sit together and know what our colleagues are doing at IIHS. It is not, not common that we get time. So yeah, thanks for that. I finally know what all my colleagues do. Okay, so this is an ILO project that we did where we looked at the dynamics of paid and unpaid work in India. And this was, if the COVID batches taught us, really pushed us in terms of our teaching capacity, this project really pushed the team in terms of our research capacities, because we really had to figure out how to do, primary data collection in the middle of multiple waves of COVID. And a huge thanks to our, partners at that point, CSDS, who was always ready. So the minute the lockdown was lifted, they would be on the field, and the day it would shut, we would start sending the data so that we could clean up the back end and stuff like that. There were 3 parts to this study. One was what we called as reproducing a household, basically trying to understand what does it really take to run a household, right? What are the kinds of paid and unpaid chores that a household needs to do for it to sustain itself? The second one was a question around deficits in decent work. That is, what do the employers really think about, the kinds of practices that they have in terms of quality of employment. And the third one was an in-depth qualitative study where we tried to understand what were the various practices and perceptions that employers had of domestic work itself, of the kind of social protection that workers should get, and also employment relationships in terms of like, what does an employer-employee relationship look like? As you know, through a lot of our work with the Domestic Workers Union in Rajasthan, for years we've been working with the workers. So this project also was an interesting opportunity for us to sort of change that gaze and say, okay, now let's go to the employers and look at how do they understand domestic work. It was really interesting because it also made us realize how difficult fieldwork is when you have to do it in employers' homes, right? Where 75% of one of the persons who did the qualitative interview, 75% of the homes shut the door on her face, wouldn't let her in. As again saying, doing research in informal settlements where we often, think it's a rite of passage where we just go in and start doing data collection. So it was really very interesting also for us to sort of completely tilt that gaze and be like, what does it mean to do research in gated communities, in high income households, in places where entry was just, like multiple layers of gatekeepers, from say the security guard to the RWA head, to the secretary of the building, to an uncle who wouldn't want us in the society. So all kinds of gatekeepers that we would have to fight to do this kind of data collection. In terms of the sample, we used, what the GIS lab and the UIL have been sort of thinking about for a very long time. So we sort of spatially divided the city into what we called as high income, low income, and middle income patches. And there's a very interesting complex methodology that the GIS IIHS lab has used, and they've written about it. So if you're interested, you can look at it. Also, we had a sample of 10,000 for this part of the study. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you're ambitious, yes. But now that the data is here, it's great. We love to boast that we've done a 10,000 household sample. So for the first part of the study, we looked at how, as I said, reproducing the household. What are the various paid and unpaid tasks that have to be done in a household for it to sustain itself? And the sample for the other two parts of the study also remain similar in terms of the pattern. The neighborhoods may have changed because, as I said, through COVID, we were moving in and out, but the logic of sample was pretty much the same. So I'm just going to move really fast because the findings, as in every other project, there are a lot of findings. The 3 reports are online on the ILO website, so you can find them there. But just to sort of break this down to you, when we said housework, we were interested in basically 2 parts. One was thinking about domestic services, so that would include paid, unpaid work, like cleaning, cooking, and all of those tasks. But the second one was what we call caregiving tasks, which means you actually care for the elderly, you care for the children, and also we try to look at how much of this work is paid and how much of this work is unpaid within the household. So as you can see, the 3 color-coded ones, the blue is where, it's not paid. The red is where, the red and blue combination is where some part of it is paid and some part of it is unpaid, and the last one is where all of it is paid. So what happens when households hire paid domestic workers? Well, women take on more work because even when we have paid domestic workers, the responsibility of managing the paid domestic worker still stays with the woman, and so we found that the number of hours that women put in is still very, very high. So of course, if we could connect this whole conversation to the female labor force participation in the country, and there are a lot of secondary level analysis one can do with this set of data. It was also a very interesting moment for us to think about how do we actually map hours in a week, right? Because if you're talking about 24 hours in a day, because there's multiplicity of tasks, that is at the same time a person is doing more than one task, like the cooker is on, you're cutting vegetables, but also minding a child on the side, perhaps a second child is doing homework. You technically, if you split each of them as individual tasks and accounted for those hours, 24 hours would not be enough, right? So it was also methodologically an important question for us to ask, how do we then showcase these hours? Like, what does it mean to say you're putting in 100 hours of work when actually you're doing it all within 24 hours. So it's an interesting sort of time use question that we had. In terms of domestic services, when you hire paid work, we realize that cleaning tasks reduces from 25% to 8%, but for women also it falls. But in certain things like caregiving, procurement of, say, water, like these tasks stayed consistent with women. And one of the interesting findings we had that if you had to go to the butchers, that is where the men's timing increased and they ironed a lot more clothes. We want to know why. Also in terms of childcare, there was an interesting split between sort of tutoring, pacifying kids, looking after them, bathing them, and all of this, all on the website, so I'm not going to go into the details. So in the second part of the study, what we then looked at was, really going to this core question of what is that employment relationship between the employer and employee look at. As I said, we've studied it, we've understood it a lot from the perspective of the workers, but if you really go to the employer side, what is the language that employers are using? What are they, so how are they articulating this relationship? So we were really interested in that. We wanted to know what are sort of, the values that they placed on domestic work. Does form of formalization matter? Like, because this is a non-contractual job, what does that relationship look like? Should there be a rate card versus should there be minimum wage laws? And I'll come to it in a bit when I talk about the third study. And what forms of sort of social protection are employers willing to give to their workers? We also realized how spatialized and segmented these markets were. So, from the union side, we know very often they go in with rate cards to different neighborhoods where they say each task, will require this much money. But it's interesting that employers also have their rate cards, right? So it's like, we always joked about how if we could just infiltrate into the WhatsApp groups of these gated communities, that's where the real juicy data is, because all the conversations on how much do you pay a domestic worker? Oh, but it should only be 2,000 rupees. Why are we paying them 2,500 rupees? So all of these conversations really were, what we were trying to get at, about how segmented and specialized this labor market was, but also how it was cut along caste in terms of who got to do what kinds of tasks in people's homes. Thinking about social identity of the domestic worker, but also the domestic work itself. One of the questions, one of the things that also came up was how much the reputation of the domestic worker really was at stake, right? And so the domestic worker was expected to perform in certain ways. So, you also had to be punctual, but you also had to be efficient. You shouldn't talk. You shouldn't, cut across the house. You can't use the toilet, but, so there are like multiple imaginary rules. The rules are not imaginary, but they're all in the imagination of the employer, that the domestic worker has to follow just to be able to maintain their reputation in the neighborhood. Otherwise, they would be fired, wouldn't get jobs in other homes. So the sort of reputation that a worker has to constantly maintain in a neighborhood to be able to find work there. And how sort of caste, language, region, all of these impacted the way workers were hired, and also what kinds of tasks they got to do and how that was distributed. I'll now move to the third report. Here we looked at how sort of employment was very thickly, segregated by location as well, right? So it was interesting to note that within a particular neighborhood, there was the same set of workers that sort of circulated. It wasn't really easy for new workers to make entry into it, and there were various ways in which this was controlled. Either, employers had long-term relationships with the workers and their families. So multiple generations of the worker's family worked with the same employer, or the same worker worked with multiple generations of the employer family. So there was this sort of relationship that, because it all came down to the question of trust, honesty, all of these value-laden words that the employers used. This sort of talks about the recruitment-based preferences. One of the interesting findings, which I did not expect, but we saw really strongly, was how there was a huge age preference for the workers. So you wanted workers who are not too young, because then they could have boyfriends, and if they were unmarried, then they could run away with somebody. And if they were too young, then they would have children that they would have to care for, and there would be too many leaves. But at the same time, employers did not want workers who were too old, because they couldn't do domestic work. It required, it's labor intensive. And so we are really talking about this very narrow window in which a domestic worker is considered to be okay to work in their household, right? So that age parameter was really something interesting for us. Also subjective judgment, like I said, had to have a long list of check boxes for the worker to be able to work in homes. And it was really interesting how employers said that they would like to keep the same domestic worker in the house, because otherwise every time a new worker comes, they have to train them to do tasks and so on. But at the same time, in the same breath said, but it's unskilled work. So on one hand, they feel it's necessary to train the domestic worker to do household chores, but at the same time, skills were considered to be the least of the concern when they hire somebody. So it was just like, all of these other things are important, but skills, what skill do you need to really dust and clean a house? There was also, I'll just close this here. In terms of the qualitative study, for us really, it was also to archive the norms and the belief systems that operated within the employer's home. Just like really go into the language that the employers used to talk about workers, to talk about this relationship. One is we wanted to think about how do you challenge this valuation of work. We know that domestic work is undertaken by women, so it's very gendered. But at the same time, it's also cut across caste. There are certain ways in which certain tasks are given to certain caste groups. So it's very deeply gendered, but also cut across caste. There are huge barriers to dignity of work. It's not considered to be work in many households, because it's just an extension of the work that somebody in the family would do, mostly a woman. It was also really interesting that we asked two questions. One was, do you think there should be law for domestic work? And second was, would you be willing to support social protection for your worker? When it came to law, a majority of the workers said no, there should be no law, because they also felt that the government should not enter the house of individual employers. And, should I? Oh, okay. So they also didn't want the government to enter the household, to enter individual household employers. Also very interesting because, unlike say many other informal work channels where you are with one contractor or one sort of employer, in the case of domestic work, you are at the same time working in multiple houses, right? So who exactly is your employer? Is it all these individual households? Is it the society that you're, housing society that you're working in? Who becomes your employer is also a question that many unions have been asking for a long time, and that's an important question, because when we think about social protection, then where does the responsibility of giving this kind of social protection, then whether it's about maternity benefits or insurance or health insurance or for child education, where does this responsibility lie? Is it with the individual households? Is it with a group of employers? So that was a question we asked, and it was quite interesting that when they said no, they don't want law, most felt that social protection should be there and that they're already doing it very informally. So, like I pay my domestic worker extra so that they can go to the hospital, or in case of an emergency, there's financial credit. All of those systems that individual households the agreements that individual households have with their workers. But the problem then is that a lot of this language is couched around, the sort of articulation is on the generosity of the employers, right? It isn't about the right or the entitlement of the worker, but the generosity or the benevolence of the employer. And so social protection then really becomes a very important way to have this conversation further, and also sort of to make sure that it's equally distributed across all workers. So when there is this employer hesitancy, the question that we've sort of explored is then how do you push it over to the other side? There are a lot of employers who are on that border. Perhaps if we had conversations with them, they would be actually willing to do more kind of legalized forms of social protection. But also when the workers said that the employers said that they wouldn't want to do it through the government because they're never quite sure if the workers would get the money that they're investing for the worker, or two, because there'd be too many bureaucratic processes, right? Like you have to open a bank account, you have to link it to an app, like all of these things that seem just too complicated, whereas it's just easier for the employer to give money to the worker and have it on a day-to-day negotiation. So all of these things, of course, we can fight it through the right of dignity framework. There's a whole legally looking at labor codes, looking at the way we understand labor. But somewhere the team, and we don't have answers for it, but it's a question that we raise in our report, is how do you sort of still scrutinize socio-economic and cultural discriminatory practices that exist in this employment relationship, where employers still don't think of domestic work as work, because in their imagination it's just an extension of what perhaps the woman in the household anyways did. And two, how do you sort of, there's a lot that I haven't spoken about, but in terms of, what are the rights of the worker at the workplace? Water, access to sanitation. Like for example, employers kept saying they don't need to use the toilet in our house because they come here only for 45 minutes. But without ever acknowledging that the same worker went to 6 to 7 households in a span of half a day, through the whole neighborhood, right? So where does that responsibility lie, and who is supposed to make sure that the workers have access to all of these services, whether it's water, sanitation, or medical aid, and so on. Just a shout out to the entire team. Also an example of all the interdisciplinary, team that it requires to pull off a project of this nature. We had the UIL, GIS, and many of us who did the both qualitative and quantitative components of the study. Also another maybe closing reflection on the methodology is that we did 400 qualitative interviews. If you want to be ambitious with 10,000 surveys, please do, but never be ambitious with your qualitative interviews, since I have taught that so many times. Whether you did 100 or 400, your data is going to look very similar, so be careful how much you commit to your funder. But that's a great fun doing this project. And we are, I mean, as I said, the 3 ILO reports are online on the website. And we are in the process of writing, the papers out of it. But also there's so much data that yes, and there's also a lot of data that we haven't even touched because the interviews were so rich. So hopefully we'll get to all of that someday soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Divya. Not exactly like this thing, but I just heard this, that there's a very interesting caste statistics that came out of this work of Bangalore versus Chennai. Yes. Say no.
Actually, I don't even know if I can wrap my head around that to answer.
One of the things that really surprised us is one of the questions that we asked was, what do you think of when you hire domestic workers? And one of the questions was, you could say not important at all, somewhat important, or very important, right? And we asked the question on, so one of the characteristics for hiring that we asked was caste. And we assumed that everyone would say not important at all, because who is going to answer truthfully to a survey on this question? So in Chennai, we got the answers we expected. Only 7% said that caste was either very important or somewhat important. I expected it. In Bangalore, it was 21%. So 1 in 5 households considered caste either very important or somewhat important in hiring domestic workers, and said so on a quantitative survey when asked the question. So we looked at the data 5 times and we kept cutting it. And the qualitative interviews held it up. So when we went, but the one advantage of doing 400 qualitative interviews, you can really test every single numerical data point we had. And we found the narratives. It is important who knows, so someone who understands, our rituals in the morning. It is important who understands our food. It's not like one is saying it's in a discriminatory way. So it was, I have to say, the depth of it for Bangalore was a little, we all took a minute. So yeah, that was definitely one of the very, very powerful data points. And the other data point I do want to mention, I think that was very important, is, a lot of the one thing about studying employers that's really useful is we also assume that low-income households are suppliers of labor. But 24% of low-income households in Bangalore pay for domestic work, which means they're also employers of domestic workers. This is a really interesting, and when I say low-income households, I'm saying less than 3 lakh annual household income. So actually, one of the really interesting things about our spatial sampling is we actually have a income distribution sample that is genuinely doesn't underrepresent low-income households. You guys would have followed the big fight over CPHS and CMIE with Gendres and Mahesh Vyas in the newspapers. And the argument is that a lot of the private data sets undersample low-income households and undersample very rich households. So they miss the top and they miss the bottom. And the example that Gendres had used is that in the Bihar sample of CPHS, 98% of households in the sample had indoor sanitation, which means that you're missing a very specific set of households in your sample, right? And the reason we're all fighting about these private sampling in newspapers is because we have no bloody census and no public data is coming. So our reliance on CMIE and CPHS is massively growing. So what was really interesting, and one thing we want to really follow up with, is to say, why are low-income households paying for domestic work? What are they paying for? What is the task? Are they freeing up time? Are they paying for childcare? Are they hiring neighbors? Are they hiring, does the same neighborhood wage rate effect hold? What is it that makes a low-income household an employer of domestic work? Because we presented this data to multiple domestic work unions. And this is the one thing every union stopped and said, hold on, go back to that slide. What do you mean? Right? What do you mean? And then the stories come out from the union. I remember in one of our meetings in Jaipur, they were like, half the members of the union said, we pay. So the domestic workers who were union said, but of course we pay because we pay her to come take care of the child in the afternoon while we go to work. So then these new patterns of wage payment behavior by low-income households, which we've completely missed in understanding the domestic work market by imagining only elite employers. So I think it's a really interesting kind of new segment. So these 2 data points, among many others, were very, very striking, I think, in the way it ran.
Thanks, Ji. So I just want to do a quick check on time. Is Smita here? No, no. She's probably doing this thing. So I just want to actually ask all of you guys, what is the best way to do it? Because we want to have like an open conversation now, right? With all of you. Want to hear about the work that you have also been involved with, but also sort of build a conversation and say that what are the things that we should start thinking about in terms of the Bangalore chapter itself? What are the activities? What are the ways we can build out? What are some of the Thanks so much, Celestina. What are some of the events we can have, things that you'd like to hear from us, all those things. So should we combine the two? Is that something that you guys are going to be okay with? Or do you have some burning questions you want to ask folks here? If you do, we can take like 10, 15 minutes on that and then start the Bangalore chapter conversation. What do you guys want to do? Yeah? You can club it? Huh. So let's do a chat more. Thank you so much, everybody. I know, we didn't have... And guys, we missed one project. Like, we just... Apagri is another project. Do you want to just take 1-2 sentences?
The only thing to say is that everything is up on the website. There's a project website. There's an online exhibition that you can go and look at our work on. And also, all the knowledge products are out on Knowledge Gateway, IIHS Knowledge Gateway, and they're really interesting. They're quite different from the usual academic output, so I do encourage you guys to go take a look at it. So the project is called UpAgri. It's short for Urban and Peri-Urban Agriculture as Green Infrastructure. We were looking at, basically how is urban farming, urban gardening taken up in cities. We were focusing on Bangalore and Pune. What we did find again was, and we were trying to make the connection between urban farming and sustainability outcomes and human well-being outcomes. So sustainability outcomes in terms of economic sustainability, social sustainability, also environmental sustainability definitely, and on the well-being side of things, subjective well-being, mental health, mental well-being, and those kinds of things. So definite positive outcome on all ends from urban agriculture. And yeah, do check out the website for more stuff.
Thank you so much.